writing, why the hell would you bother? And we're hoping that Wayne's going to talk enough to you, either get inspired or at least not waste your time trying to do it. Because you don't have the stamina in you that it obviously requires.
It does
and
take
I've been talking to Wayne in the past, but Wayne, you've written 3 books, 3 film books. I mean, also you've got a career of reviews and articles for magazines. But in a short space of time, you've had 3 books published, starting with Tom DiCillo, one of the great independent filmmakers who did Box of Moonlight, Johnny Suede, and Living in Oblivion, one of my favourite films. And then you did a book on Burt Reynolds' film and television work. It was probably the most extensive book written about the man's film career. And that led to a memoir with Nick McLean, one of the great cinematographers that people probably don't even know they've seen his work. But tell us this before we get into that and talk about the rigors and the hard work involved in that kind of work that you do. How did you get into this game? How did it start?
Well, it all started about maybe 10 or 11 years ago, which is when I started my professional writing career. I started off literally, I had a phone book sized portfolio of amateur scribblings that I put together over a number of years. You know, I just wanted to write my feelings about movies that I was watching down somehow. And, you know, they were terribly undisciplined. You know, there was no form or function to them. I just wanted to write down what I thought about this movie, whether it was good or bad. And eventually I ended up with this huge, big phone book sized thing of reviews. So my friend Sarah said to me one day, why don't you try and get published somewhere, you know, go to a magazine or a newspaper or something like that. So I thought about it and I thought, sure, who's going to hire me? I didn't go to college. I didn't study journalism or literature or anything like that. You know, who's going to take me on? But I said, okay, I'll go to the Leinster Leader, which is the biggest newspaper here in Leinster and Kildare. So I rang them up quite brazenly and asked for a meeting with the editor to show him my portfolio. And he said, yeah, come on in, we'll have a meeting, which was great. So I went in and he kind of summarily flipped through the portfolio. I don't think he actually read any of the reviews, but at the end of the meeting, he said, you're hired, start next weekend. And that was the start of literally my writing career. You know, I was thrust straight into, I had a whole page. So I was like 2 reviews, 2 cinema reviews and a DVD review, and then a column as well sometimes of just other film news. It was great. I mean, the fact that I was being published and doing this thing that I loved and getting a few quid for it, you know, it meant a lot to me because I never thought I'd be in the position to be published in a local newspaper, let alone writing books later on. And it felt like my thing, you know, it felt like finally something that, you know, I always kind of wanted to do, even though it wasn't like what you'd call full-time, you know. If it taught me anything, it was more about structuring a review, you know, in terms of, okay, you have your plot synopsis and then your thoughts about the film and your summary, you know, that kind of thing. But it didn't really, because of, I guess, the films I was reviewing, it didn't teach me a whole lot in terms of the depth of my writing, you know what I mean? Because they were all very, it was films around 2009, 2010, blockbuster stuff. Mostly, I did get to review some older films, retro screenings, and the odd art house film. But it was mostly big summer releases and, you know, big mainstream stuff. And, you know, there wasn't a whole lot to write about, you know. So my very first gig, actually, my very first job at the paper was reviewing, I think it was the 6th Harry Potter film. It could be around 5th or 6th, whatever it was. And I had never seen a Harry Potter film before in my life. So, of course, I was diligent and I went and rented all of the previous ones and spent a whole day watching Harry Potter films. Oh, my God. One of the things I hate, it's probably the biggest chore when you're writing criticism or writing about films, is the damn plot synopsis. It's a chore because all you're doing is just relaying information that's there on a PR sheet, you know what I mean? And you can't really make it interesting. You can't give away too much, you know. So I generally try and summarize it in 1 or 2 lines if I can, and then leave the rest for critique, you know. And I tried as much as possible to bring critique to that kind of, you know, regional newspaper. But that's, you know, at the end of the day, it's probably not what people who are reading are looking for. So it's not that kind of outlet. You know, like I say, occasionally I did get to write about an older film or an art house film that gave me a bit more leeway of interpretation or critique. But, you know, if you're writing 350 words about The Proposal with Sandra Bullock, the hell am I going to say?
So what caused the first book to be written? When did you decide to write about Tom DiCillo?
So after I lost the Leinster Leader gig, you know, for years I've been turned down to go to film school. Every film course you can imagine in Ireland I've been turned down from. So eventually I got to the stage where I was old enough to apply to Dublin Business School as a mature student. And of course they took me because it cost about 7.5 grand a year. So they're not going to turn down that. So I got in there, got turned down from everywhere else in the meantime. But I wasn't a big fan of it there. The course wasn't for me. It was very introductory. It was very, it's for someone who's coming fresh from school and doesn't have a background or maybe a great history with film, you know what I mean? So it was that kind of course, but not for me. So I left after second year because I just couldn't justify the expense of going there and not getting anything from it. So in my despair after I left, the thoughts of having to go find a job and probably something I didn't like or didn't want to do, and I said, oh geez, what the hell am I going to do? So at this point I had known Tom DiCillo because I'd interviewed him for a newspaper and a magazine for the release of his Doors film, When You're Strange, which I loved. And so I'd kept in contact with him because he's my favorite director and I loved talking to him and picking his brain, and we got on very well. So once
that was kind of the last indie work he did, really. It has done in a long time. He's done a lot of television now, yeah. Yeah,
well, he did a proper indie, as in totally financed and shot and edited, directed by himself, called Down in Shadowland, which has received some festival screenings and whatnot, but didn't get a general release. But When You're Strange would have been his last or most recent big film. It was a wide release, and did very well at the film festivals. But we kept in contact, and at one stage I said to him, Tom, one of the things I've always wanted was to walk into a bookshop and buy a book on your career. The only thing I could ever find was a paragraph or two on him in movie encyclopedias, which was never enough. I always wanted a book about him, his life, his movies, all that kind of thing. But you could never get it. And there's a series called Director's Cuts, which is published by Columbia University Press, and I used to always go into the IFI shop and ask them, is there one of these coming out on Tom DiCillo yet? And he'd look it up. He's like, no, nothing there on Tom DiCillo. So anyway, I asked Tom. I said, listen, would you mind if I propose this idea to you, which I want to write a book in your career? And he very generously said, that sounds like a good idea. Let's have a talk about it and see what we come up with. So I just basically laid out an idea, a plan I wanted to do, which was to chapter on each film. So there's 8 films, a chapter in each, and at the end of each one, a Q&A with Tom, which digs in deeper goes beyond my discussions, which were very thematic, analysis. So at the end of that, me and Tom would have a Q&A and we'd dig in as deep as we could about the making of the films, so it was part my analysis and part Tom's, interpretation as well as mine. It was 5 years of discussions, and that's what got us to the final draft. But along the way, I think Tom suggested that, maybe we could get Catherine Keener to talk to us because she's in, 4 or 5 of his films. So she's a major part of his body of work. And of course I was like, yeah, Catherine Keener, that'd be great. So Tom hooked me up with Catherine and we had a chat over a number of days and she was fantastic. And I just thought, God, if we get this good from everybody from the films, wouldn't that be something? So it led from Catherine Keener then to Steve Buscemi, who's another huge part of Tom's career. And he knows him, going back to the early 80s. So they have a good, deep friendship there, which we explored as well. So then that would lead to, say, Chris Knott, Matthew Modine, Maxwell Caulfield, Melanie Diaz, Kevin Corrigan. Basically, everyone, all the main actors from each movie, with the exception of Brad Pitt, who we almost got. But, after I penetrated those layers of people who surround him, all his protectors and handlers, there was a lot of back and forth. Oh, Brad's free this week. He might be able to make it.
Part of the process, isn't it, when you're doing something like this?
Well, not for me, mainly because 99% of the time I usually get a straight introduction to somebody.
So to go back a bit, you were 5 years in the making, and that's a long time. You would obviously have to be earning some money in the meantime, but you'd starve to death. So, and also this is a book that didn't have a publishing deal, am I right?
That's right. I didn't know what was going to happen to the book in terms of will this be published. I just had a drive and a passion to do this, and I didn't even think for the first 4.5 years. I definitely didn't think is there going to be a publisher for this, because I didn't want that to impede on the process or put me off, the thoughts about, oh, this might not get a publisher, or will an audience be there for it? I didn't want to think about that. I just assumed the book will be finished and then I'll worry about that. So come to the end of the book, I was literally just wrapping up the book, and I said, okay, now I'll start approaching publishers. So obviously the first ones in mind, for me was Columbia University Press, because I always envisaged the book being part of that series. That's just something it was just a personal goal almost. Their whole thing is they're director focused to each one. So this is a John Carpenter one, there's a David Cronenberg one there, Steven Spielberg, Clint Eastwood. So they consider directors that are part of this series to be of utmost importance on an international scale. So that's the way I always looked at Tom. He's influential, he's important. I wanted him to be part of that. So I approached a couple of others, and unbelievably, Columbia got back to me and said, this is something we'd be very interested in. Tom DiCillo is very much part of that, canon of directors who we consider important. So definitely, please send us on the manuscript. So I sent them the manuscript, and about 2 or 3 weeks later, they said, we'd love the book. We want to take it on. Here's the deal. And I couldn't believe it. And the result of it is this. So it's now part of this whole series, which to this day, I cannot believe when I walk into a shop and I see it there, So that's how it worked.
And how many million did you get paid for your first?
Oh, man, I lost count.
So this is the portion of the interview where we say, don't do this at home, kids. Or do. I say do, because it's a big thing to do, to take on that time. But obviously love and passion is what fueled the writing. But obviously you have to be able to write, or there's no point in doing it.
Well, that's it. And again, I was probably, I was doing it unschooled, so I was never quite sure if what I was writing was any good. I know that Tom would have a look at my pages and say, yeah, this is brilliant, or, how about we delve into this team or that team a bit further, maybe go less on that. But in terms of the actual writing, I didn't have anybody there. I didn't have an editor. I didn't have anybody to say that's good or bad, fix that.
Did Columbia provide one in the end?
I had an editor, but the way that worked was they ended up publishing the book exactly as I handed it to them, with the one exception, which I couldn't believe, which is the one exception they asked was, could I add an extra introduction at the start just to put it in an academic context, to say for students coming to this book, that these films and this artist is worth exploring in an academic context. Now, the book isn't an academic piece, which is strange for that series, because these are all highly academic books. For me, it's not enjoyable to read. I don't read academic books, and they're there for information. That's all they are. But the way I approached this was, I wanted this book to be approachable and enjoyable to anybody, regardless if they're an academic or maybe they just have an interest in film history or indie cinema, or just about the stars who are in the book. I wanted it, and it's a story, and that's my approach to these books as well. It's a story. It's not just critical analysis. I want you to learn about the arc of these artists' lives. Well, I think we went further than had it been an academic book, because it was so personal, because Tom went that far with me. You cannot talk about Box of Moonlight without talking about Tom's growing up and his father and all those circumstances. So the book became a personal journey as well. And because I ended up interviewing the likes of Steve Buscemi and Chris Knott, people who know Tom for 30 or 40 years, it became so much more than, oh yeah, I worked on that movie with Tom. It was more than that. It was, we really dug into his background and his early years in New York and meeting these people, and his immersion into the no-wave scene, the indie scene, the local theater, off-Broadway, all that kind of stuff. So it opened my eyes as a fan of Tom, and just getting to work with Tom over 5 years was an incredible experience. I mean, he became a very dear friend to me, and I spent a week in New York with him as part of my research. I went over to New York just to talk to him for a week and get the bulk of all those main interviews done. And every day I went up to his apartment on the Upper West Side, and each day we spent, hours talking about one specific film. So that was our work for the day, It's just an unreal experience. And, I'll say the best thing about writing these books is the people you meet. And it was incredible. It was an incredible experience, apart from the getting published and all that.
How do you separate the fan from the writer? Is it just pure discipline when you get down to it? Or, as I said, it's just lovely to see you so buzzed by your own, kind of seeing your book in the shops?
Yeah, I mean, I don't ever want the fan to be too far away, because if the fan's not there, I don't think the passion will be there. I think you always have to have an element of a fan, because that's what drives you. I mean, I wouldn't be writing these books had I not been a fan, so I can't just approach them from kind of an objective journalism or academic point of view, because then I think the heart and the soul is going to be gone out of him. I always have to treat these people. Oh, there is an element of elevating him to a degree, because in my mind they are artists who are very dear to me and very influential to me. So there is, I love these people, so I wouldn't do it otherwise.
But would you worry about that for future work, where you might feel, okay, I might need to critique a bit stronger here and say negative things about an artist?
Well, you have to be honest, I guess, and I was, even in the Burt Reynolds book, not every Burt Reynolds film was great, and sometimes I had to critique his work. But in terms of Tom's work, I didn't have to face that challenge because I love all of his films.
That's fair enough. That's. But one day it's going to happen, and they'll be alive when you're critiquing their work. First book published, it was a labour of love. So any money that came was extra potatoes, or whatever they say.
Yeah.
And 5 years is a long time by any stretch. Obviously you were doing other things and you were trying to eke a living out. But Wayne gets involved in Burt Reynolds next. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, well, the way that worked was the book came out in, I think it was December 2017. And immediately when it came out, obviously it was very exciting, and your first published book, and seeing it the way you always imagined it to be was just completely surreal. And as soon as I finished, I never had any designs on doing more books or becoming a writer of books. That just never crossed my mind. I just wanted this one Tom DiCillo book on my shelf, But then as soon as the book came out, I kind of found myself wanting or needing to be writing again, because I did spend 5 years doing it, and it was part of my life. I mean, when you're a writer, there's no clock. You don't clock in and clock out. If you're home, you're generally working and writing and whatever it is. And if you're not interviewing people, you're editing or you're writing pieces. So as soon as the Burt Reynolds or the Tom DiCillo book came out, I kind of had to think about it. I was like, okay, if I'm going to write about something next, what's it going to be? And it has to be something that I'm equally as passionate about as Tom DiCillo. So I thought about it like, okay, I've done my favorite director. How about my favorite actor? And I don't have a huge list of favorite actors. I'm definitely more of a director kind of person, or DPs and people like that, editors, than I am into actors. But I thought, okay, here's a short list of actors I'd love to write about. I wouldn't mind sitting up at 3 o'clock in the morning with my eyes falling and still typing. So who will do that? Who will keep me going? And I came down to a short list of people like, Clint Eastwood, John Wayne, Dennis Hopper, and Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds being number one. And, John Wayne and Clint have been written about, Dennis a little bit as well. But nobody has really, in my mind, written a satisfactory book on Burt Reynolds' work. He has 2 autobiographies himself, which are all, very personal. And there's a couple of other books about his personal life, but that has no interest to me whatsoever. So I just wanted to write a book about the films and some of the TV shows, at least the ones he was a star in or a co-star in. So I approached, again, there was a publisher I had in mind because I knew their inventory. I knew they had a great selection of film books and they were fantastic. But part of my deal with Columbia was that they had an option on me for my next book. So whatever my next book was going to be, I had to at least offer it to them. Mm-hmm. So I kind of thought to myself, they're not going to go for this, So I went in somewhat skeptically, and I said to them, listen, I have an idea for my next book. It's going to be about Burt Reynolds and his film career. And as expected, they said, Wayne, we're sorry, Burt Reynolds isn't really part of our world. He's not part of that whole idea of, world-renowned directors, filmmakers, whatever it was. So I'm sorry, we're going to have to decline that. It's like, thank God, because now I can go to who I wanted to, So I wanted to go to McFarlane. So I approached McFarlane. I sent a proposal in, and they said, you know what, Wayne, where we are, they're based in North Carolina and London, but they're based in North Carolina. They said, here, Burt is not just a film star. He's a local hero. He's an icon. He's a legend. He's an American hero. So yes, we'd love to take on this project. So I was over the moon. But the only thing there is, now I have a deadline. And the deadline was a year. So I went from 5 years writing about 8 movies to 1 year writing about 120 movies. It was more difficult, I guess, in terms of each one was probably about a different movie. It wasn't all, say, like in the first book, it was all Tom-centric. We were talking about one guy and getting an insight into this guy and some of the films, a couple of films. but each interview was about different movies and different times in film history as well. So you're jumping from, it could be the 60s or 70s to recent times, and yeah, it was huge. It was a huge book, and yourself, you've seen the book. It's massive. It's an epic tome.
You left out all the stuff, his cameos in Archer, but we won't go into that.
I've gotten abuse from several friends for leaving out Archer.
What else was it about Burt Reynolds that attracted you?
I think there's a depth to his work that has not been written about, and there's a depth of themes there that spans entire decades. He's been talking about family life in particular since the late 60s, right up until his last film, The Last Movie Star. And the theme of family is something very important to me in my work. It's the central theme of the Tom DiCillo book, probably. It's there in a lot of my work, and it's something that fascinated me about Burt. But another thing about Burt was he always felt like the one movie star, even though he was the biggest movie star of all time for 5 years and a huge figure in film history. There was something every man about him, for lack of a better word. You know what I mean? You felt like he was one of you. You know what I mean? You never felt he was up on a pedestal. But he could also be very sophisticated and very witty, as you'd see in the likes of Fade In or Starting Over or Best Friends, films like that. So he wasn't just kind of doing the country hero, country bumpkin kind of shtick all the time. He could do those really smart roles, and I think one of his best films is Hustle by Robert Aldrich. Where it's this dark neo-noir thriller, and he's playing obviously a throwback to the film noir detectives of the 40s, but in a very progressive modern 70s variation. And I think that's just a prime example of when Burt could be great and understated and intelligent and witty and romantic. And that's just something I wanted to write about, because you probably know yourself, whenever you read about Burt Reynolds, there's usually several films which are always referenced, and they are Deliverance, Smokey and the Bandit, Boogie Nights. He did these huge TV shows as well, like Evening Shade and BL Striker. And I mean, Evening Shade was such a huge success, yet when he died, nobody mentioned it.
The deadline was your biggest challenge. How did you approach that challenge in structuring your work schedule over that year and your approach to the work?
That was an intense year, let me tell you, because...
And were you just doing that all the time? You weren't working on anything else at that stage, were you?
Well, I was. Well, apart from I was working a full-time job, but also 2 months into the Burt Reynolds book, I signed a third book deal, and I started on that at the same time. So I was literally juggling 2 books for that year.
That would be the Nick book?
The Nick McLean book, yeah.
You still didn't have as much of a deadline with that book now, in fairness. It wasn't going to get in the way of you finishing your Burt Reynolds book.
No, but I had the same deadline almost. It was just 2 months ahead. Well, basically how it came around to that book was I had approached Nick McLean to talk to me for the Burt Reynolds book, because he's an intrinsic part of Burt's life and career, because he shot so many of his films and they were good friends for 40 years. So I said, geez, I got to get Nick McLean in here. And again, because I'm interested in hearing from those kind of guys more so than, say, Burt's leading actresses or any of that kind of stuff. So I said, I have to get Nick McLean. And Nick McLean had shot some of my favorite movies and some of the best films of the new Hollywood era. I mean, you're talking McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Sugarland Express, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Deer Hunter, Heaven Can Wait, Marathon Man, Looking for Mr. Goodbar, The Goonies, Short Circuit, Cobra, Where Do I End? This is apart from all the Burt Reynolds stuff, so I knew, God, it'd be great to talk to Nick McLean. So I tracked him down, I think it was on Facebook, and I typed in Nick McLean just to see if he was there, and I couldn't see anybody that recognized him. I said, feck it, I'll take a chance, send an instant message or whatever it was. And within an hour, he got back to me and he said, yeah, Burt Reynolds is a big part of my life, so I'd be happy to talk to you. So we arranged a chat, Skype chat, talked about all the stuff I needed to talk about, all the making of the movies, his friendship with Burt. And I asked him would he be interested in doing my forward, because I hadn't realized just how great a friendship they'd had and how much they meant to each other's lives and careers. So I thought, this guy's ideal for the forward. And he was more than happy to do that. He wrote a terrific forward. But I wouldn't say, again, like with Tom DiCillo, we kind of kept chatting. We just kind of enjoyed each other's company, and we would have further Skype chats just talking about movies and life and stuff like that. Really, really enjoyed Nick's company. I still do to this day. He's one of my best friends. But I just chatting to him one day, I said, Nick, how is there no books on your career considering what you've done? And he said, if anybody was ever going to write a book about my career, I would want it to be you. And that really meant a whole lot to me. It was huge to hear that. So I said, well, you know what, let's do it. So I went, asked around with my publisher, and within a week I had a publishing contract for that book.
Writing the Burt Reynolds, you were back to writing analysis and critique for each film.
Well, this was definitely, of all my books so far, this was definitely the more, I guess you could call it objective, because, I wasn't working with Burt on the book. He died about 3/4 of the way through it, and all I shared with him was a correspondence, single correspondence, but we never got to chat and officially sit down and go through his career. So I wasn't really working with anybody in particular. So it was definitely more objective than the other books in terms of I'm going through each film, writing, doing a background making of kind of stuff, and juggling that with my critical analysis, because that's, to me, at the end of the day, that's more interesting to me, is just writing about what I see in these films or what I feel from these films and the teams. And it was intense, very intense. I'd seen most of the films. I had most of the films, so I was very familiar with them. So that was a big boon. I mean, if I'd gone into that book cold, God, it would have taken 5 years.
There's a lot of television stuff that you would have had to track down.
There was a couple of ones which are extremely hard to get. Very, very hard. You can only get them maybe in some countries, or you can only get them on VHS or something like that. But, I spent a few quid and I got those ones just to complete the collection and make it as comprehensive as possible, because why write about 98% of them when you can get them all in there? So
yeah,
it was great. It was fun times, but it was intense, man. A really, really intense period.
What was the biggest revelation for you?
The films that I came out loving was probably the biggest surprise, because there's the ones which are great, the undisputed classics like The Longest Yard and Deliverance and Smokey. But you know what? I ended up loving some of the ones in between, some of the smaller ones. I loved when he did these smaller indie movies, when he got to play around a bit more. There was less expectation on him. But I also love that period which I discovered him, which was the 80s period. So Stick and Malone, Sharky's Machine. I mean,
which wasn't a great decade for him, really, at all. He was struggling with it, and he ended up in the video shop quite a lot around that time.
Yeah, I mean, personally speaking, it was a bad time for him. Commercially speaking, like, he was still getting paid big money. Like the likes of Orion, Mike Medavoy was paying him $3 million to star in Malone. So they had faith in him that these were going to be big movies, and he was still a big marquee name. But he hadn't that kind of cultural cachet that he did 10 years previous, Smokey and the Bandit and all those kind of movies. So the movies didn't do as well in the box office, and he lost some of the power that he had. I mean, he struggled with Stick, with Universal. There was a big power struggle there between them. But you have to remember as well, in the 80s, it was the era of the hyper masculine body, with Jean-Claude Van Damme and Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone. And Burt, at that stage, he was never like that. But he still had that ordinary guy look about him. Almost a kind of a cross between Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson, almost. I don't know. I always found myself attracted and going back to those smaller movies in between, because I was less familiar with them than, say, Deliverance and those other movies. So for me, I had to go back as well, purely for the sake of the book. I had to delve in deeper to them more because I was less familiar with them, and I ended up loving them. So.
And the later work, did you find yourself enjoying his older performances?
There's some of the films which are pretty bad, but I'll always enjoy Burt's performance in them. That's one of the great things about Burt Reynolds. You could watch him in absolute trash, and he is still enjoyable because he brings a sense of fun and a sense of delight to a role, no matter what it is. So
I think the kind of peak of that in some ways was probably Hooper.
Oh, Hooper's fantastic, and I think it's an underrated film. It's actually a very good film as well. It kind of gets pegged in with the Stroker Aces and the Cannonball Runs because it's of that era. But it's a terrific look at, the unsung heroes of film world, which are stuntmen. I don't know, it's Burt in his element, but it's Hal Needham making a very good film as well, which he does not often get credit for. There's a lot of great stunts and great set pieces in Hooper, but it's a much more human story. And I think it's the best on-screen pairing of Burt and Sally Field. You can really, really feel the love in that movie, as opposed to, say, Smokey and the Bandit 2, where you can see the cracks were in their relationship and it bleeding out on screen. It's a very emotional film, so there is some drama and some dark thematic undercurrents in there underneath all the stunts and bluster. But
I think he was having too much fun for some critics, and that's why they just kind of dissed him. Because
yeah,
all they were getting was him and his mustache and his shit-eating grin, and they couldn't enjoy that.
yeah, I agree. I think Burt always enjoyed himself on screen, and again, even in the darker films, you can just tell he's relishing it, And I don't know, maybe it put some critics off or something, or maybe
he did a remake of a Truffaut movie, The Man Who Loved Women,
and that was a Blake Edwards film. He worked with some amazing directors, and that's one of the great exciting things that for me approaching this book was I was getting to write about all these great directors that Burt worked with, And again, it's something that's forgotten about, that when people are talking about Burt or writing about Burt, that he worked with some of the best, and they loved him. They loved him. I mean, if you read any interviews with these guys, they loved him.
Apart from that guy punched in the head.
Oh, that was Dick Richards on Heat. Yeah, maybe he doesn't love him.
Did you hit your deadline on time, or was it a bit after the mark?
Yeah, I think I went maybe about a month over, just because a number of factors. I ended up going on a nationwide tour with McLean in the middle of it all. So that kind of pushed things back a little bit, And then there was a couple of other just personal factors that came up. But it was grand. I got an extra month or so, and that was it. It was great. The Burt Reynolds book came out in December 2018, 19, whatever it was. And then 2 months later, the Nick McLean book came out. So it was a roller coaster in terms of getting them out and promoting them and talking to everybody and doing our thing and book launches and all that. But like I say, me and Nick did that tour, which was amazing. It was one of my favorite times of my life, where we got to go around all these great venues in Ireland and have what we called an evening with Nick McLean, which were these live on stage Q&As that we did talking about his career. And some of the venues, some of the theaters, they'd show maybe the Goonies or Cobra or Short Circuit or Spaceballs, whatever it was, and we'd do a masterclass before and afterwards, and it was unreal. It was just like pinching myself. I'm on the road with Nick McLean, going around Ireland and having fun. It's unreal.
So tell us a little bit about that book. Now, this is more of a memoir and a co-written piece.
It is.
You're very. I don't know. It was interesting that you gave Nick that credit. I'm sure he would have told you not to.
Well, I felt that he gave me so much information, and his words are so important to the text. He was my partner for that year, you know what I mean, and on the tour, and we just had an incredible bond and a great time writing it. I mean, the way it worked was it was all conversations. Like Tom DiCillo, it was all conversations, and I would work with Nick's words and work them into, in and around my words. So in the book, it's essentially Nick's memoir. It's his life story, his journey through the films. But I appear before each part, kind of giving the historical and cultural context of the movies that he's worked on, because there's, as you know, there are some serious heavy hitter movies in there that require such context, So that's my job. I'm kind of the commentator on everything in there, and it was an interesting book. I mean, it is a memoir, but I'm in there kind of guiding everyone through. And one of the great thrills of the book as well was talking to Mike O'Shea, who's another great camera operator and DP who worked with Walter Hill, and he worked with Joe Dante and Joel Schumacher and all these great people before he went on to be a DP for Mel Brooks. And Mike did my foreword for that book, which is, again, a huge thrill to have someone of Mike's caliber and who's gone on to become a great friend of mine. I just, it's kind of pinch me moments, to see my name alongside these people on the covers, because I grew up watching their movies and they're such a huge part of my life. It's weird now when I was up in Temple Bar last Halloween, and we were watching, myself and my wife were watching The Lost Boys at the outdoor Halloween screening. In the middle of it, I was just marveling at Mike's camera work, and I texted him in the middle of it, like, hey, I'm here watching The Lost Boys, outdoors in Dublin. And he texted me back and just had that weird pinch me surreal moment of, I just text cinematographer, the cameraman of The Lost Boys, just weird moments like that. You kind of have to remind yourself, I am a fan. I'm not just a writer.
Kind of takes care of the research.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's it. You when you talk to these people, they give you so much because they worked on the films and they know the people you're writing about. It's better than trawling through 1,000 textbooks or other books, because they're giving it to you direct from their own experiences.
And what's interesting about Nick, for instance, is that there's the modesty there that belies the talent.
I love that about him. There's a kind of almost a kind of a crew mentality to him. He's not pretentious in any way. I loved that about him. If anything, I went into that book probably thinking, okay, he's a director of photography. He's world renowned. He's one of the best. I'm gonna have to up my game here. I'm gonna have to talk about mise en scène and color and composition and cameras. And I probably sounded completely pretentious in my first couple of questions with him, but straight away he was all about just the stories. He's not into the technical end of it, which I loved. It was great. It completely disarmed me. Some guys are like that. Just some guys are very technical and they talk about film stocks and camera lenses and all that. But Nick just he has an incredible eye, and he's just very humble about what the work he's done. But I had to keep reminding him that the stuff he has shot is hugely influential, hugely important, and that's why I was writing about him. And he understood that, but he's not one to kind of dine out on it.
Your new book, which is going to be published later in the year?
Next year. So I'd say it'll probably be mid next year, I assume.
How did that come about? Tell us how it came about and what it's about.
Again, same thing as with the Tom DiCillo book in terms of I finished the two books, my two last books with Burt Reynolds and Nick McLean. So I just found myself wanting to write. I did say afterwards that, I'm going to take 6 months off and do nothing because I was absolutely burnt out and exhausted. Non-stop writing, late nights, no sleep. The way it would work is, I'd come home from work at 5:30, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, start writing, go through to maybe 3 o'clock, some nights 4 o'clock, because you have to remember I was also working as a journalist at the same time. Mm-hmm. I was working for Hot Press magazine. So I was juggling the daytime job, the Hot Press magazine work, and 2 books. So I had to stay up till 4 o'clock and or else something didn't get done. So I was just burnt out after it all. I needed a rest. And after a month or two, I just said, you know what? I miss writing. I want to get writing again. This whole thing of sitting on my ass on the couch is not for me. I need to be working. So again, I had to think about what do I want to write about next? And one of the things I'm very passionate about is the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And again, like the Burt Reynolds stuff, there are certain elements of A Nightmare on Elm Street which I don't feel have been explored in great depth in literature. So that was my angle. I just wanted to write about the whole franchise, film by film, delving into the themes that Wes Craven laid down in his first film. But again, the book has become something different. I mean, it's not just my analysis anymore. It's become this huge theme because I've ended up talking to many directors, cinematographers, and I recently spoke to Robert Englund, Freddy Krueger himself, which I couldn't believe. That was one of the highlights of my career. It was one of the most amazing 2-hour conversations of my life.
Do you have a specific target in mind about the original franchise when you went into writing the book?
In terms of my ideas and the themes?
Yeah, and what you were going to present at the end of it all. Because one thing about the Nightmare franchise is more recently, a lot of stuff has been written about it. When you're going for any subject, it's great now where the publishing lies with it. Yeah. So you're not wasting time, because there was always that danger with some stuff that you could write it and find it either no one wanted it or there was a legal reason that you couldn't complete the damn thing.
It's been so scrutinized and documented over the years, as you say, in documentaries and whatever else, that I don't know, maybe they're sick about it at this stage. I don't know. But see, the existing New Line aren't the New Line really that made the films. Bob Shaye isn't the head of New Line anymore, and New Line is part of Warner Brothers, so it's a whole different thing, So I didn't go. It is the story of New Line's rise to success is part of the New Line or the Freddy Krueger story, because they call New Line the house that Freddy built, because the success of A Nightmare on Elm Street enabled New Line to become the company that it did and fund other films. These other kind of maverick filmmakers, and they took chances on indie movies and art house movies, all because of the success of A Nightmare on Elm Street. But it's part of the story, but it's not, like I say, I didn't want it to be too much of a making of book, because that's there already in other texts. I'm talking to a lot of the filmmakers about the stories, about the characters, about the themes that are lying there underneath the surface, and that's my angle on it. And I've had some success in reaching people, which has been great, but I'm happy now. I have Robert Englund, I have some of the directors and DPs and some of the actors. I've reached my target now, so it's just a case of finishing the book, putting it together, and looking forward to it coming out. Maybe we'll have a Q&A with Robert at the end, because it was such a special conversation that it'd be a shame to just pepper his quotes throughout the text, which I'll do with some of them because they're vital to certain things I'm talking about. But I think that we'll wrap up the book on a good Q&A that me and Robert had, which was unbelievably fascinating. Robert is so loquacious and such a great raconteur that it was one of the best conversations I've ever had with an actor or filmmaker.
Vincent Price of the 2020s.
Yes, absolutely. Oh man, he's so full of personality and so full of these great anecdotes and stories. And he told me about his time. He was here on holidays, I think last year, and he's so literate that as you're talking to him, you'd swear he's reading from a text. He's theatrical. He comes from a theatrical background, and he's just one of the great pleasures I've had in this career so far was talking to him.
And obviously Wes Craven is not here anymore.
Wes is gone, unfortunately. The first chapter of this book, where I'm talking about the first film, is kind of the tribute to him, because in that chapter I talk about his other work as well, and he was such an influential director for me. I mean, he's one of the great Hollywood directors of all time, certainly the last 50 years. I mean, he was unrivaled in the horror genre as a director of intellect, intelligence, and depth. He brought a great kind of social awareness and social conscience to these, which are on the surface monster movies. But if you look at A Nightmare on Elm Street, the first one, and the series as it develops, it goes into themes of family and broken homes and divorce and abuse and alcoholism and all that, and that stems from A Nightmare on Elm Street kind of being this allegory for the nightmare of America, the death of the American dream and the death of American innocence after the 60s and the kind of decadence of the 70s. And you have these burnt out parents, middle class parents with the nice picket fence and the tract houses or whatever they are, but their kids are messed up. They're chemically dependent, or they're medicated, and Freddy's kind of the manifestation of maybe the guilt and the sin of the parents. So there's all these wonderful themes in there, which I find immensely fascinating.
So what do you think is the key thing that makes those films so successful?
Oh, Robert Englund, without a doubt. I think on the surface, I have to admit, on the surface, they are monster movies, and that's why kids, when I was a kid, gravitated to them. It's because of Robert Englund. It's because of his portrayal of Freddy Krueger. But as we get older, well, at least some of us, as we get older and we live with these films, we gravitate to the themes that are beyond the surface. And I think that's why they're such a rich franchise and so great to mine for these kind of themes, because it's all there.
Well, we were saying this before, but the interesting thing about Freddy is he's an anomaly. He's the first monster that came along of all the monsters in the 70s and 80s that had a personality.
No, absolutely not. I mean, if you look at part 2, there's a shot in part 2 where there was some negotiating hardball going on between Robert Englund and New Line over payment and whatever, bringing them back for the second one. So there was a bit of hardball being played, and they got this other guy. They cast this other guy as Freddy, and he's in there in a couple of shots in part 2. One notable shot, which is in the shower sequence where the teacher gets whipped with the towels, and he comes in and he's this big lumbering lump of a guy walking like Frankenstein, and that's the guy that they replaced Robert Englund with. No, Jack Shoulder said after seeing it, I said, screw this, get Robert Englund, whatever you do, because this guy is not going to work. You can't just put any guy in a mask and he's Freddy. Freddy Krueger is Robert Englund, and Robert brings that sense of theater, that sense of mime and dance and swagger to Freddy Krueger. He brings such great depth and subtext to the character that wouldn't be there if you just put a stuntman in the suit.
Mm-hmm. And so, another year deadline for this book?
Yes. So, but I've got more of a handle on it these days of how to juggle everything. I don't write for Hot Press anymore. It was getting too much, juggling magazine work, a day job as a librarian, and writing books. But I am working on some other books at the same time. But like I say, I have a bit more of a handle on how to juggle everything and how to divide my time. And
so just tell us a little bit about your music writing. You're doing a few music bios. Is that very different to approach? Is there anything to think about differently when you're doing that?
Well, it's different in terms of my music criticism work with Hot Press, because that was literally, more journalistic work where you're reviewing albums, reviewing concerts, interviewing artists about their latest release or whatever. But with the music books that I'm doing, they're memoirs, so they're autobiographies or whatever. So they're very personal. And it's a different approach than, say, the Nightmare on Elm Street book, which is you're approaching an art form and you're analyzing it, criticizing it, whatever, and you're interviewing all these people about the making of them. It's much different. It's a much more intense situation because you're never off the clock. You're always striving for those personal stories and the personal background, and it's such a thrill, because it's very interesting. It's a different kind of book than writing about the making of movies or whatever it is. But I absolutely love it, and I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't love the people that I'm writing about.
Again, that muscle of you have to love the subject before you can go near it.
Oh, you have to. Absolutely have to.
Yourself primarily as a film writer, music writer, gun to the head, which one?
Oh God, I'm happy enough to say writer these days. Just in general, because I've done so much stuff now over the years between newspapers and magazines and books and websites, whatever, that it's kind of oscillated between film and music all throughout. Because I got Hot Press not through my own approach. They asked me, because what happened was a friend of mine was playing here with his band who were headlining Slane, and I knew Hot Press were doing a special issue on the band. So I approached him. I said, listen, if you're interested, I can do a freelance piece for you. I'll interview my friend. He's more than happy to do it, and you can have it as part of your piece, your special edition. So they took it on. They published it as part of the special issue, which was great. It was a great thrill for me as a long-term reader of Hot Press. I've been buying that for years, And I got a call from the editor one day, and she said, "Hey, would you like to join the team?" And I was working a crappy job at the time. I was like, "Holy shit, are you serious?" Absolutely, yeah. This is amazing. Yes, and it was all because of that article that I did. A great boon to me, and again, it's never thought I'd be writing for Hot Press, so it was unbelievable.
What's your rewriting policy?
I don't tend to do multiple drafts. I tend to all keep it in the one document and just work on a piece until I'm happy. I don't go back too often unless for technical reasons. Say I get an interview late in the game and I have to go back and put them in and maybe shape the piece around their words a little bit more. But other than that, I just tend to work on it until I'm happy with it, and the book kind of builds as I'm going along, and I know I'm happy with it as I'm going along. I very rarely go back and do a second draft or anything like that. And I say the biggest conversation I've had with an editor was on the first Tom DiCillo book, like you said, where they said, "Could you put in this extra introduction?" And that was the biggest change I've ever had to make in terms of a manuscript. And that was nothing. I mean, they didn't touch a word of my book as I gave it to them. So they just suggested putting in this extra bit, which was great. I couldn't believe that, like, Columbia University, one of the great kind of academic places in the world, took my book without changing it. You know what I mean? I was fully expecting to come back with heaps of notes and guidelines on what to do or suggestions, but no, they loved the book as it was, which was a tremendous boon to me as a young writer, starting out my first book. So,
any advice for budding writers? I mean, it's a very specialist kind of area, and I think it takes a certain kind of energy and passion. Would you agree with that?
Oh, without doubt. I mean, you're not in it for the money or the glory. You're in it because you're doing something you love. You're immersed in this world. You know what I mean? You're contributing to the history that has meant so much to you. You know what I mean? Like, in terms of, if anybody wants to study Tom DiCillo now, they study my book. I've been talking to some people in various universities it's on the curriculum. You know what I mean? Because if they're studying Tom DiCillo or indie books, it's on the reading list. So they have to go and get my book and flick through it, whatever it is. So, you know what I mean? To be able to contribute to an artist's legacy or history is such a huge thrill. You know what I mean? And you would never exchange that for a few quid. Just that feeling alone that you've done some good work and you've contributed to film literature or film history or film criticism, whatever way you want to put it. I mean, that to me is the biggest thrill of all, and getting to know these people, is just incredible. But I would say the most important thing is, I guess it's an any arts criticism, but film in particular, is watch the bloody films. Watch the films, goddammit, because when I was in college, sometimes we'd be studying movies and you had to do exams on them. Some of the people didn't even watch the movies, and I was like, how can you write about a movie or answer questions and you haven't even watched it? Because they can sell textbooks, which gives them kind of information on them. They think that's enough, but I always think you have to understand the art. I mean, you have to spend time and live with these movies, And I mean, for me growing up, my film school was my living room. My teacher was the films. The films and the art itself is the greatest teacher of all.
Yeah, and your own point of view, as we were saying, have a point of view.
Yeah,
and you have the right to have a point of view as much as any academic or any other writer who puts pen to paper.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have a point of view because.
But you get it from the source. You don't get it from another book you read.
Exactly, you know what I mean, and it's engagement with the text. I think that's important. You know what I mean, and bring your ideas, bring your history, and bring your interest in maybe certain themes. I mean, you could be looking at a film and you might spot a theme in there and think it's very prevalent and very important to the context of the film. But the director mightn't have put it there, or it mightn't be there, but you're bringing it to it. And I think if you write well and you bring some depth to your analysis, it's completely valid because art is in the eye of the beholder. You bring to art your own history, your own sensibilities. Even though I've written the definitive book on Tom DiCillo, I would love to see someone else write a book on him because I'd always be open to hearing other ideas. It could have been something I've missed or someone might add to something that I've written about, but I would just love to see these artists being celebrated, not just by me, but by many other people. So always open to hearing other people's ideas. That's what I love about film criticism and film history is reading other people's interpretations of these texts. You know what I mean? Because that's what it's all about, really. That's what we're doing. We're bringing our ideas and histories. That's what it's all about to me. That's exactly what it's all about.
So what are the lessons learned then from what, if you were to go back and talk to Wayne when he was starting out his writing career, would you have anything to say to him and say, no, don't do that? Or what would you say?
God, what would I say?
Because you did everything wrong, let's face it.
I'd say have more belief in yourself early on, because you would often hear whispers of, oh, who's gonna publish that, or that no one's gonna want to read that.
You did do that,
Yeah, I had to overcome some of those kind of negative comments, but I don't think I would change anything. I mean, I'm so happy to the point of where I am now. I mean, I wouldn't change a thing because if I changed any of it, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today. And what I'm doing today is I'm living the dream of working with these artists that I really love, some of whom are my friends, and I wouldn't change a thing because writing is just a great life. I kind of fell into it, I never set out when I was a kid I wanted to be a writer. I knew deep down I wanted to do something to do with film, and it turns out that maybe I have a knack for writing because editors and publications seem to like my work, so that's something.